Hey everyone, welcome to On Tap. I'm Chris, and today is our second country profile video where we will be talking about a number of major export beers from China, specifically Tsingtao, Lucky or Lucky Buddha, and Yanjing. Let's go. So for Westerners, Tsingtao is probably the most well-known, or really only, Chinese beer you might be aware of, or at least historically that's the case. And there's a very good reason for that. Tsingtao is China's second largest brewery with 15% of total domestic market share, which only puts it behind snow beer, which is apparently the highest selling single type of beer in the world, but it's very difficult to find outside of China. Now, as I talked about in the Sapporo episode, with a lot of East Asian breweries, there's often a very notable European influence in the beer brewing tradition, specifically an influence from the Germans. This is the case for Tsingtao. The brewery was founded in 1903 by, you'll never guess, but a bunch of Germans, specifically from Bavaria. They set up shop in the province of Shandong in the city of Tsingtao, which the Germans refer to as Tsingtao, hence the name of the brewery. Now, if you're wondering, how in the world did a bunch of German settlers end up in Shandong province in the early 1900s? Well, the fact of the matter is that 1903 was squarely within the high tide of European imperialism, and at the time, the German Empire had exclusive rights to parts of the south coast of Shandong for all of a hot second. History aside, basically what that meant was you had a bunch of German settlers who ended up in this part of China and they got a brewery going, which eventually became the basis for China's biggest export beer label. See, who says gunboat diplomacy doesn't have some long-term upsides? Now, long story short, World War I happened, Germany lost its Shandong claim, along with, the war, and the territory reverted to the Japanese, who ran the Singtel brewery until they got kicked out of China at the end of World War II, at which point the brewery finally became a privately run Chinese company until the Chinese communists took over, and then it was a state-run enterprise for a number of decades. Then starting in 1972, the beer really started getting exported out of China. And 1972 is important because, well, that was the year that Richard Nixon made his famous trip to the PRC to meet with Mao Zedong and establish formal diplomatic relations between the People's Republic of China and the United States. And Tsingtao definitely benefited from that trade deal. It became soon the most widely exported beer to the United States, a position that it still holds today. The beer was exported more broadly around the world starting in the late 1980s, and then in the early 1990s, the company was finally privatized due to Chinese market liberalization. From the early 1990s until 2017, the company was partly owned by different foreign conglomerates, but I understand that as of now, it's 100% Chinese owned. Currently, Tsingtao is sold in 62 countries around the world and makes up over 50% of all beer exported out of China. So chances are, if you're drinking Chinese beer, you're drinking Tsingtao, or you've at least had it at some point. I know I have. Now, in contrast to Tsingtao, Lucky Buddha beer, sometimes just called Lucky beer, is a very recent competitor in the Chinese beer market, having only been established in 2010. Yet, in that short amount of time, the company has really made a name for itself as a major competitor and worthy adversary to the likes of Tsingtao and other Chinese beer labels. During the 2010s, Lucky beer was in fact one of the fastest growing exported beers to the United States, which probably helps explain why I can actually find it in stores now. Currently, Lucky beer is available in 28 countries worldwide, and the company puts a very important focus on environmental policies, which is always a great thing. For example, they focus on only using packaging that's easily biodegradable, and they have a commitment to not using polystyrene, since polystyrene is a product that breaks down and biodegrades. Basically, it never does. Now, I also want to talk about the logo for a second, because Lucky beer is one of the most unique beer bottles that I've really ever seen, in that the image of Buddha is actually blown into the glass itself, where Buddha is holding a gold ingot above his head. Except here's the thing, he's not actually Buddha, as in the guy who founded the religion. He's, you know what? I'm just gonna let Sam O'Neill explain it.
2. The OG Buddha wasn't the obese guy. That's Budai, a Chinese folk character meant to represent Maitreya, aka future Buddha. Number 3, Buddha wasn't a god either. He was just a guy.
If you haven't checked out his channel, I highly recommend doing that. Though at this point, he only posts like once a year. So Sam, if you're watching this, we all miss you. So Happy Fat Jolly Buddha is actually just a Chinese Chan monk who lived about 1,000 years ago and is a totally separate person from Gautama Buddha. I guess Westerners getting Gautama Buddha and Chinese Budai confused would be if like people in East Asia got Jesus and Santa Claus confused, thinking it was basically the same guy before and after switching from a diet of enlightenment and frugality to milk, cookies, and presumably other baked goods and desserts. And also please note that Chinese Budai and regular Buddha are definitely not the same as Space Buddha. So what were we talking about? Beer? The last company to be discussed here is Yanjing, or Yanjing. The company, officially known as the Beijing Yanjing Beer Group Corporation, was founded in 1980 during the early days of Deng Xiaoping's government, when he and his advisors were considering some early forms of market liberalization in China. However, unlike the other two companies discussed in this video, Yanjing was actually from the start set up as a wholly run state enterprise, something it currently still is. It's 100% owned and operated by the PRC. Now, the name Yanjing derives from an older name for the city of what is today Beijing. I don't want to say that Yanjing was the original name of Beijing, as that city has gone through a number of different naming conventions over the centuries, but certainly for some period of time, especially during the 11 and 1200s, holding that name mostly during Mongol rule under the Yuan dynasty, following the conquests of Genghis, or Chinggis Khan, as people are more apt to say these days. As befitting a company that's run by the PRC, Yanjing has a big footprint with anything relating to Chinese government operations. It's been served at numerous state banquets, and it's also the official beer of Air China, which is the flag carrier airline of the PRC. And as befitting a massive government operation, business is huge. 48.6 million barrels of beer every year are produced, which is a lot of beer. That makes Yanjing the 8th largest brewery in the world and the 3rd largest brewery in China. And that really puts in perspective, I think, just how massive the mainland Chinese market is. I'd never even heard of this beer until I started researching it for the video, and it turns out it's a massive state-owned government enterprise. So this section might be a little repetitive, but we're going to quickly go through each of the 3 lagers produced by the 3 Chinese companies talked about in this episode. Singtel Classic Lager. This is a classic pale lager brewed with the 4 basic ingredients needed to make beer, plus rice. I understand that there are also different versions of Tsingtao out there, but I think they're only available in mainland China. Lucky. This is also a pale lager brewed with your 4 basic ingredients: malt, hops, water, and yeast, plus rice. The company says that Lucky's very good with Chinese food. It pairs really well with those flavors, but can also work in any particular situation. And I would imagine the same goes for Tsingtao. I kind of sound like a broken record at this point, but Yanjing is also a pale lager brewed with the 4 basic ingredients needed to make beer plus rice. Interestingly though, the company lists the beer in a can at 5% ABV, but in a bottle at 4.5% ABV. Interesting. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's that time of the episode, the tasting part. So first up, we have Tsingtao. Nice golden lager color. It doesn't look too thin, actually. It's got a nice golden color. Yep, smells pretty clean. Oh, and that's a perfectly nice lager. It's nice, it's clean, it's crisp. It's a little smooth too. It's not particularly hoppy. It's actually very well balanced, and I could see it working in pretty much any situation. You just want a nice, clean, crisp, refreshing table beer. So next up we have Lucky Beer, or Lucky Buddha Beer, or whatever you'd like to call it. And yeah, just take a look at the bottle here for a second, if you can see, right? It's a very interesting shape. It's sort of wide at the bottom and it tapers up a little bit, and we can indeed see Buddha, or Budai. He's a Buddha, right? Not the Buddha, but a Buddha, unenlightened one. And yeah, it's a lot of blown glass work here, which I find very interesting. And also the 6-pack container for this, because of these bottles, they're sort of extra wide. You actually would have quite a problem if you were trying to fit this into another 6-pack that's not designed for Lucky Beer, just because of the width of the bottle. You know, it's quite a fat bottle. You know, sort of like this Buddha here. All right, let's get it opened up. Enough talking. Time for drinking. Same color as the Singtel. Smells about the same, or doesn't have a lot of smell. These are very, very similar beers to each other. We're dealing with really, really, really small gradients here in terms of taste difference. This is also a good table lager. That's how I would describe it. I'm gonna take another taste and see if I can get any other notes that might be slightly different from this one. Maybe this one has just ever so slightly more sort of crispness to it. I wouldn't even say that this is malty though, because this is also a well-balanced lager. These are both perfectly fine, but yeah, I mean, I'd say a Tsingtao tastes like a Lucky Buddha, and a Lucky Buddha tastes like a Tsingtao. Either one of these are gonna be basically the same. They're almost interchangeable products, and they're both perfectly fine, again. So this is perfectly nice to drink. You could have this in any sort of climate. It would work very well in hot weather. And I think this is sort of the idea when the company says it, it works well with Chinese food. Specifically, if you're gonna have certain flavors that there might be a bit more sort of that umami flavor, right? Things that are more sort of based on soy. And of course, obviously, we're talking about different regions of China. Like, they're obviously very different types of cuisine depending on what province you're in. There's all of that differentiation to keep in mind. Last but not least, we have Yanjing, or Yanjing beer. The beer of, I guess I don't want to say the beer of the PRC, but a wholly owned government company. So very much a beer associated with the Chinese government. Exact same color as the other ones. Doesn't really smell like anything. I'm not getting really anything on that. So this is a beer, and it's just out of the light beer category. It has sort of sufficient amounts of that body that you don't feel like you're drinking something that's watery. There's not much flavor in this beyond just that. And compared to these other two, I would say this is the least enjoyable. It's the least interesting of the three. If there's nothing else to drink other than really bad light beer, and you want something that is absolutely at just the minimum level of what would be considered a regular beer, okay, fine, sure. But other than that, you could give it a pass. I was actually chatting with my videographer, a guy called Musu. He's actually Chinese. He's from Beijing. When we were talking about these, we came upon the word fresh to describe how these taste. It's sort of a characteristic flavor that you get more with certain East Asian lagers, and I think it's a great term. I've talked about bright for Mexican beers, crisp for sort of certain German beers. Sometimes I've said oaky, right? Sharp, I mentioned that with Sapporo and a couple other beers, but I think fresh is a good word to describe with this. And that goes with the food pairing. Right, as I said, that both of these you could have kind of on their own, but they would also pair very well with the very, very diverse set of cuisines that you find across China. And you could maybe even say East Asia more broadly, especially if you're thinking about this in terms of things like sauces and sort of what sort of spices are people using? Are people using soy? Are there sort of umami flavors that are coming through in the food? So broad trends that you're not going to see as much in European food. And sort of European-inspired food, obviously, in places like the US and Canada. And so these beers work very well with that. As I kind of talked about in the Southeast Asian episode, it makes a lot more sense when you do think about how these beers are kind of brewed, and you think about the environments that you're drinking them in and the flavor profiles that you're having. And I think here the flavor profiles with the food is very key. Because please remember, plenty of parts of Northeastern Asia, they're not tropical places, they are very temperate, they get very cold in the winter. So it's not about the weather so much, those are 4-season climate areas, it's about the food that you're having it with, and also the ingredients available. Again, we were chatting just before the break here, and we sort of got on the subject of rice as well, that how much is the rice really used in the brewing process affecting the flavor that we're picking up here with the Lucky Buddha especially, and Tsingtao a little bit. So anyway, yeah, so that's my assessment of these 3 beers from China. I get these are major beer labels. Another friend of mine, she mentioned that these are sort of in China super obviously well known. These are not craft beers in any sense of the word, as I've mentioned with the production volume. So maybe one day I'll do craft beer from China. But for now, at least for sort of major export brands, this is my assessment. What do you think? Any viewers from China, if you're tuning in, ideally I'm assuming you're using a VPN. Let me know what you think. Did I do a good job? Did I sort of not rank it correctly? And yeah, let me know in the comments. Obviously, as always, just keep it respectful. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.